All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of the Awkward Sports Podcast, the first of 2025. And yes, I'm about to go talk Gator sports while wearing a Vegas Golden Knights shirt. It's what happens when you dress for the day forgetting you're going to record. But enough about that. Josh, the page is turned for the Gators. Yeah, some schools who are in the college football playoff are still in 2024. The Gators are now in 2025. They won the Gasparilla Bowl. They had the turnaround, especially on defense. We got to see the rise of DJ Lagway. Not quite how we expected him to enter the fray, but that's how he did. Gasparilla Bowl MVP. Things are starting to look on the up and up for the Gators. They have one of their best recruiting classes, especially in the wide receiver class that we have seen in a long time. I think we just got to start asking the question is what are reasonable expectations for next year?
Well, I think you kind of previewed that already in your opening statement. You talked about, the Gators are on the 2025 while other teams are still playing in the college football playoff. That's the goal for next year, to still be playing at this time of year while other teams have moved on to the next year. I think if you looked at the Florida Gators recruiting class, they've cobbled together a top 10 class. They got a lot of returning players and a lot to be excited about bringing back DJ Lagway, star freshman who won basically almost every freshman honor you can think of in terms of All American by all these different articles and all these different columns, giving him freshman All American. This dude has a bright future. They went out this offseason so far and added receiver depth. You like to see what they're continuing to add on the defensive side of the ball, especially on the back end and the secondary. So, a number of big time pieces added that have been led by Billy Napier and the crew, and even notably, Vernell Brown Jr. and his agency. Florida has been humming recently on the recruiting trail and in the transfer portal. So there's a lot to be excited about there for Florida football and adding players and bringing those guys back. The other side of it, it's another daunting schedule in 2025. We looked at this year's schedule as a schedule where Florida would be lucky to get to 500. I thought after 2 weeks or two out of three out of the first 3 weeks out of the bad losses from Miami and A&M, I thought I saw maybe 2 wins. This team gathered their composure, got themselves together, and rattled off 8 wins and four down the stretch of the season. So there's a lot to be excited about with Gator football. But now it's about raising those expectations, taking that next step, and getting to the college football playoff.
I completely agree. If you think about it, think about how close they actually were to pulling that off despite that 1-2 start. You have the potential, let's say they beat Tennessee and Georgia. Lagway plays the whole game. I don't think if Lagway's a starter the entire time, I don't think they beat Miami. They had a lot of things to figure out, same with Texas A&M. But I think in another scenario where Lagway doesn't get hurt against Georgia and he plays the full game against Tennessee, I think they win those games. They go 9-3. They would have the second best conference record in the SEC. They would have been in the title game. And do they beat Texas? Probably not, but I do think it's a different situation with Lagway being healthy and being on a neutral site. Again, I don't think they win, but I think it at least would have been more of a game than it was the 49-17 loss in Austin. I think that was the score once it was that misery was over. But I think that's just how you have to realize like expectations can fully go up. Will they make the college playoff going 9-3? If that was their record, I think they would have because they would have had zero unranked losses and they would have beaten Georgia and Tennessee. Now, if they lose to Texas, I almost said Tennessee, in the SEC championship game, that probably takes them out of the playoff because I don't think you can ever justify a four-loss team in the playoff. You can barely justify a three. But at least then you have the narrative of they had those big wins. They were in the SEC title game. They probably go to the Citrus Bowl, maybe win that, finish 10-4. I would say if they don't make the playoff next year, if that at least happens, let's say they don't make the college football playoff. I just want to get your thoughts on this. let's say they don't make it, but they at least get into the SEC title game. Is that, let's say, the floor for expectations? Because they at least were in, they at least did that.
I think if you get that close, it's going to come down to the eye test, right? How did the team look? What were the circumstances that went into them getting there and then missing the playoff? I think there's some other factors that I have to wait and see on because there could be a side of that where I'm like, you know what? I still believe in this team. I still believe, like, hey, they got to the SEC title game. I know they missed the playoff, but they looked really good all season and they got to the SEC championship game. Whereas the flip side of it could be, well, they really got to the SEC championship game this year, maybe because the conference had a down year that many people didn't anticipate, and we didn't really look that good. And we didn't make the playoff for that very reason and still came away without an SEC title. And then if I'm looking at it from that perspective, then I'm like, you know what? Billy Napier's been around here long enough. We've seen what might be the ceiling for this program. Yeah, there's been some things to be excited about, but other coaches that we have run out of town have achieved more. And then it's time to look in another direction. So I think it really comes down to how the team plays and as a major factor into that end result, not just that end result.
I think that's a very fair way to put it. Now, I think in that scenario, even if Napier comes back in the question, he does not get fired because then he still has that improvement to keep his job. But I do think you're right. If you have a scenario like this year where they don't have any unranked losses, they get the big wins, but it just happens to be where it's like, well, you gotta think of it this way too. I think this time around they do have to beat Miami. Cam Ward's not going to be the quarterback next year. They could probably get away with losing to Georgia again, just because that's the top team. You probably lose to Texas again. Those are probably the two acceptable losses still, even if it's not necessarily acceptable to lose to Georgia, if that makes sense. And I'm trying to think of like, how do you balance it for the college football playoff? You know, I was trying to like paint an example, but it might be based on how things are supposed to look next year. I was originally thinking 9-3 might be sufficient enough. I'm saying this mid-episode. While it could have been 9-3 in 2024, it might have to be at minimum 10-2 in the regular season. Third loss coming in the SEC title game for that to be acceptable. Because like the more we talk about it, the more I'm almost rethinking things a bit.
Yeah, no, I mean that's something I've been pounding the table about. I definitely think if you're going to get in, you have to hit that 10-win mark, and I think that's about time. It's about that time for expectations, right? We look at again some of the past regimes that we've run out of town. Mullen most recently in year one took a mess and got them to 10 wins. And listen, I get it. I get all the yeah. Well, he didn't get us to the college football playoff, or he didn't get us over the hump. I totally understand that. Let me raise you this scenario.
I
Look
still
at
don't
Penn.
miss Dan Mullen, by the way.
That's fine. I'm just throwing this scenario out here. Look at Penn State, right? James Franklin, Penn State's kind of tired of them. They're not winning the big games. And I don't think Penn State's really won a big game yet either. But look at the scenario that they're in right now. Penn State was always on that fringe, on that cusp in the top 12, but never good enough to be a top four team. Then now the playoff expands, you get in as maybe a lower tier team, and you end up getting a favorable matchup in the college football playoff. You get an SMU at home, and then you go and you play a Boise State, some mid-major teams, or Mountain West or Group of Five teams, or whatever you want to call it in college football, and now you're in that top four. I look at that and I'm like, that might have been where we would have been at with Mullen, but now we're with Napier, and now it's going to be about like, hey, it's time to get to that 10-win mark. If some of the coaches we don't like have gotten there and had success, now it's about with the coaches that we believe in. Maybe a Billy Napier can't be that guy. Now you got to hold that same standard. If we hold that standard to the ones in the past, now it's time to hold that standard to the coaches that are in house. That's the
Yeah,
point I'm making. Not necessarily going back to the Mullen era, but more saying, hey, we held Mullen to this standard. We've given Napier about 3 out 4 years. it's time to hold Napier to the same
No, I
standard
fully agree.
as we
Like
did.
I've always said, the trial period is the first 3 years. If you get past the first 3 years, it means you're supposed to do more. You have at least shown you're capable of doing more. Even if Napier has not done better than 8-5, he is coming back next season because they think he can do more based on how the season finished. And I think we all think the same way based on how they play. If that was the same Florida team the whole year, they probably go at minimum 10-2. I still think they lose to Miami and they lose to Texas. But I think this version beats A&M. I think this version beats Georgia and Tennessee. That turns 7-5 in the 10-2. SEC title game, boom, 10-3. Probably goes to the Citrus Bowl. Boom, suddenly we're in this made up scenario we've been discussing for the last several minutes. And I think in that scenario, 10-2, title game loss 10-3. You win the Citrus Bowl, for example, you finish 11-3. I would say that. I think now that we've bounced this idea back and forth a little bit, that is the floor, the absolute floor, I think going forward.
I
You're at
agree.
least played the conference title game, you had double digit wins, and anything above that's the college football playoff.
I completely agree. I think you have to hit double digit wins this season. I think you have to make the college football playoff. I get that. I get that there's a scenario where 9-4 is an improvement because the record 9-4 is obviously better than 8-5. I understand all of that, but I think it's about time where, like, yeah, a one game improvement doesn't quite do it for me. Where it's like now it's time to make that jump, right? You've
Well,
been
it is a
here three
bit
years
different, I will say,
and
'cause in
get
that
there.
scenario, it can still be. Sorry to cut you off. I apologize, but I just wanted to chime in and be like, it is a little bit different because it would include the SEC title game, and then you have the bowl game on top of it. So in theory, they can still get to double-digit wins. It would just not be the ideal way that they do.
Right. No, yeah. Like it's I think at the end of the day, you got to hit to that double digit win mark. I think we can both agree on that. And I think we can both agree on that. We have a little bit more hope going into next season than maybe we did 4 weeks into the season. So there's a lot to be excited about for Gator football in 2025. Hopefully they're playing in the college football playoff. Hopefully they're playing in some of these major New Year's Six bowl games. But a team that we can have hope in right now, Harrison, this Florida Gator basketball team, undefeated in out of conference play, 13-0 to start the season, the number 6 team in the country. They start their conference schedule here against Kentucky in Rupp Arena, one of the toughest places to play. And there are no breaks in this schedule, Harrison. I thought going into this season, I thought Florida basketball would be a very good team. What I did not see was how good the conference would be as a whole, top to bottom. They start with Kentucky with the new head coach, Mark Pope, and Kentucky hasn't skipped a step. That's the brand that Kentucky is. They bring in a new coach. They still succeed. That's who they are. One of the toughest home court advantages. And now Florida has one of their first true tests of the season, playing a top 10 team in the country. This is where we're going to see what Gator basketball is made of.
We definitely will. Look, we're already seeing a very historic year for Gator basketball. They're 13-0. If I remember correctly, this is their best start since the year they won their first of back-to-back national championships. I think they started 17-0 that year, 05-06.
Special
And
teams.
yeah, so history might be repeating itself a little bit. And I'm trying to find some more parallels here, but I just realized, okay, yeah, Billy Donovan a couple years in did reach the Final Four, but it wasn't this type of starts. So yeah, it would be credit to Todd Golden. He might be setting himself up for a nice run in, I believe it's year 3 of his tenure as
Yes.
Gator head coach. It's 3. Yes.
Yep, it is. If you looked at the way, and like you go back to the Donovan era, right? You saw the way they played. They were a defensive team. They slowed you down. They were suffocating. They made every possession like each possession was worth so much. They slowed the game down. They had experience. You go into the Mike White era, it's a different style. They come out of the gate. In Mike White's second year, they make a run to the Elite Eight, but then they can't seem to recapture the magic after that. And with teams that had high expectations, Mike White was a good recruiter, but they didn't see the results on the court. You saw, especially the year in 2019, that there was 2019, 2020, all the excitement around Scotty Lewis, who was at the time a projected lottery pick, Trey Mann, a 5-star point guard, and that team flopped. That team did not do a whole
No.
lot and
And
was a
in the end, too,
preseason
Trey
top
Mann
10.
was the only one who was a first round pick.
Yeah, and they
He
were
was a middle of the round.
they were a preseason top 10. And now you look at what Todd Golden's come in and taken over. The first year, it's about, more of like playing his identity of basketball. Second year was, all right, let's get more of Todd Golden's guys in here, crush the transfer portal, bring in more players. And it was really a theme of almost. The Gators almost won every game in SEC play at home. The Gators almost won the SEC tournament. The Gators almost did all these different things in college basketball, but they weren't quite over the hump. Then you look at this season. Well, they didn't have an almost non-conference play. They actually went undefeated in non-conference play. That's a great start. Now it's going to be a gauntlet. Anything less than 6 losses in conference play is a great year considering how tough this conference is top to bottom. And then it's about putting the chips down and balling out in March, going through that conference tournament again, getting into March Madness and making noise, because this team has been spectacular. But the next question that Todd Golden has to answer is, can you get a high seed in March Madness, and then can you make a run? Because even Mike White made a run in March Madness. Billy Donovan made plenty of runs in March Madness. There was a time where the Elite Eight for the Gators was a given. When they made 4 straight, and then they finally went over the hump and got to the Final Four in 2014. The standard is being restored slowly for Gator basketball, but you like the growth. You like what they've done in the portal. But now it's about answering that next big question, which is the gauntlet that is the SEC. How can they fare against the Auburns now, Kentuckys, Tennessees, and Alabamas? How can they do against these programs?
Exactly. And this is not your typical SEC basketball conference. Normally, when you talk about where are the top 2 sports in the SEC, just maybe I'm biased due to media attention, but you typically think football and baseball. Don't get me wrong, great track and field, great softball, but those are the first 2 sports you typically think of. You don't really think basketball outside maybe Kentucky, Florida back in the early 2000s. But now suddenly Tennessee and Auburn are the top 2 teams in the country. Florida's number 6. Alabama was in the Final Four last year. Kentucky's always going to be Kentucky. Everyone in the conference has a winning record right now. Even if it's South Carolina at the bottom at like 9-4.
Something like
That's
that.
the worst that's the worst record in the conference. No one is
Insane.
no one's 3-10 right now. No one's even I don't even know how to do math. No one's 6-7.
Vanderbilt's got 1 loss. Georgia's got 1 loss. We kind of look at
Right.
those programs in college basketball as programs that are usually near the bottom of this conference. I mean, Oklahoma, one of the newest SEC additions, with Porter Moser, the former Loyola coach that got Loyola to the Final Four. Oklahoma's an undefeated team right now. So there are only 3 teams remaining in all of college basketball that are undefeated: Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Florida. It just means more, baby. It's the
Yes, it
SEC,
does.
and it's all that's left in all of Division I college basketball that's undefeated. 3 SEC programs. Harrison, if Florida beats Kentucky and Alabama beats Oklahoma out of the gate, that second matchup between Florida and Tennessee
Is
could
the
be
end
for
of yeah.
all the marbles. It could be for the last team standing that could be undefeated. We could very well be on here in a couple of weeks saying Florida's the last team standing undefeated. That's something to play for right there. And it's not even February, let alone March. So there's a lot to be excited about, but now the schedule gets tough. Now they're playing more of a challenging opponents because, yes, Florida went 13-0 and out of conference play, and that's fantastic. And I would take that every single year. But you look at the out of conference schedule that they played, and it wasn't really strong. They had a couple of signature wins. No question about it. They dominated the ACC. They beat Virginia. They had that resilient game in the Jumpman Invitational against North Carolina. They beat Florida State. They've won some of these ACC games, and they beat Wake Forest as well. So like it's respectable out of conference. They did what they had to do, but now it's going to be playing a really hard team and then playing another really hard team and then playing another one. You start out with number 10 Kentucky, followed by number 1 Tennessee, and then number 23 Arkansas. The toughest stretch that they've had all year starts right now, and I couldn't be more excited to see if they're up for the task.
Yep. We'll see how it is. You have to wonder with all the quote unquote easy wins how they will do. But I think we can at least pinpoint to that UNC win that they are capable of overcoming adversity when the game gets tough. Because even though UNC's 8-6 right now, and they have not been beating those top teams, they've taken them all down to the wire. Auburn had a tough time. Just making sure I get the schools. Yep. Auburn had a tough time. Kansas had a tough time. Alabama, it was within 15. They're still UNC. Even if they're not over the hump, they've been a tough opponent like they always have. So you get that test, you pass it, gives you a little bit more hope than if they're just beating up on others. I know they still have the Wake Forest blowout, the Arizona State blowouts. Um, but I feel just getting those blowouts aren't really going to prove anything besides how to run up the score on some teams. But now you at least have the resume that says, all right, well, we've been there before when things got hard, which is good because you're going into a tough conference schedule. Maybe they'll pull it out. They got 18 games coming up. I think you said six would be six or fewer losses. So that puts you at 12-6 is the minimum for a
25 and
stellar.
6.
I was doing conference record.
Right. Yeah. No, I was putting it like the 12 and 6 plus the added would put you at
Okay, okay,
25
okay,
and 6.
okay. Sorry, I'm like, did I just forget about several games on the schedule? Oh, I guess we're playing in the May now. Okay, uh, but yeah, so we'll see how we'll see. Sorry,
No
I'm
question
losing my
about it.
composure a little bit there, so I'm trying to pivot to you now. But also, one more thing, it's funny for some reason for football, Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC makes total sense, but for some reason it just doesn't fully compute for basketball yet. It's like, yeah, no, they're still 14 for basketball. That's just how it works. You bring up Oklahoma, I'm like, oh, that's right. They play in the SEC for every program or for every sports.
And there's no question about it. We know like what those two programs bring to the table. Texas, Oklahoma, it's a basketball. We know what this 16 team conference is, but you see obviously with in the NIL era, a lot of that money that you get from football, they can start sprinkling it
Yeah.
around. You see the conference thriving now in basketball, and we obviously know what they are in baseball and in a lot of other sports as well. It kind of seems like the future is the SEC in almost all sports, and we're definitely seeing it now in college basketball. Well, there's a lot to be excited for Gator football heading into 2025, and there is so much to play for Gator basketball this season. We will be right here to break it all down for you on the Awkward Sports Podcast. That's Harrison. I'm Josh, and we will see you next time.
Peace.
Peace.